Welcome to Session 8 of the 2021 UPRT Safety Summit for Professional Pilots Worldwide. My name is Paul B.J. Ransbury. I'm the CEO of Aviation Performance Solutions, and it's just a great honor and a pleasure to be here with Captain Brad Bennetts, who's an internationally recognized expert on fourth-generation Airbus upset prevention and recovery training. Today, Brad is going to talk to us about the topic of essential stages of airline UPRT instructor training. And he truly is an expert, great guy, well-spoken. He's also very passionate about the topic of upset prevention and recovery training. Before we jump over to Brad, let me just talk a little bit about his background. He has 20 plus years as a Boeing and an Airbus airline pilot. He's flown on the Airbus A330, A340 as an instructor pilot for South African Airways and also a line pilot. He also teaches upset training on the Airbus A320 as well and the 737. He's an Airbus display pilot, also for South African Airways. He has 17,000 hours of flight time on over 65 airplane types. His all-attitude experience is extensive. For 18 years, he was a competition and air display flying pilot with his own airshow team, which was very, very successful. He's also an airshow display authorization examiner. 6 years now full-time as an Airbus type-specific jet upset training instructor, and he is just a real champion of upset prevention recovery training, is just the sought-after expert in Airbus upset training implementation and development. So Brad, without any further ado, it's just really great to have you here all the way from South Africa. I'm sorry it's so late in the day for you, but we really appreciate you being here at the event. Why don't we hand it over to you and take it from here, Brad?
Well, thank you, BJ, for that warm introduction, and good day to everybody from my side. Although this presentation is titled as an airline UPRT program, it in fact refers to any operator program where simulators are used for training, be it a Part 91, 121, or 135 operation. So first, let's state what the aim of UPRT training is. The overarching aim of UPRT is to develop the necessary flight crew resilience to prevent and recover from all undesired aircraft states, including upsets. The ideal UPRT program involves both ATO training and AOC training. IATA recognizes the benefits of an AOC and ATO partnership, which helps to ensure a top-down approach to our training. The ideal UPRT program structure should therefore be designed as a coordinated effort between the operator and the ATO. It should include consistent on-aeroplane and non-type specific UPRT by the ATO, and type-specific UPRT for the operator. Some of the challenges that we face include costs implementing an effective UPRT program, includes the myriad of circulars, legislative and guidance documents that can be quite overwhelming from the outset. And there's, of course, deficiencies in the experience levels of instructors with regards to their exposure to the all-attitude environment. If we have a look at the all-attitude environment, we can see the pitch is on the vertical scale here as represented on this diagram, and roll on the horizontal scale. Our normal envelope that we operate in on a day-to-day basis is represented by that orange circle. The upset definition makes up about 5% of the potential flight envelope, up to 45 degrees of bank. Our max licensing limits are in yellow, and that makes up about 11% of our potential flight envelope. And then there's the all-attitude daily threat that requires special instructor skills and knowledge. In this area, our queuing is unfamiliar and unexpected, instructor skills and techniques are absent, and our pilot psychology and physiology is altered. According to ICAO document 111, regardless of an individual's background, all instructors assigned to provide training in a UPRT program should successfully complete a UPRT instructor qualification training course approved by the licensing authority. There's consensus that special emphasis on instructor training is needed as, and I quote in UPRT, the safety implications and the consequences of applying poor instructional technique or providing misleading information are arguably more significant than in some other areas of pilot training. So in short, the end goal of UPRT instructor training program is to give the instructors the skill sets required to teach other pilots the discipline, the technical knowledge, insight, and motor skills to recognize, avoid, and if necessary, recover from an aeroplane upset. This requires a finely tuned combination of lectures, guided discussions, demonstrations, and preferably on-aircraft in-flight teaching, as well as, in some cases, computer-based training or online video training. The most significant challenge that the instructor will have is really to become familiar enough with the training materials and the course construction in order to eventually connect the dots of the program, so to speak. When starting a UPRT project, operators should first select an individual or a team to be charged with the design and implementation of the program. Now, this team should be what we call it, the core group of instructors, who will then set up the UPRT program. Operators with several fleets might want to select 2 instructors per fleet as core instructors. Now, although not mandated, it's certainly my recommendation and that of ICAO and IATA that the core group attend an on-aircraft combined simulator trainer program. And I'll discuss this in a bit more detail during the presentation. After completing the trainer program, the core group will then design the type-specific program for the airline. They'll then run the UPRT and in parallel train the remaining regular instructors of the operator for that task. Now, when selecting instructors for the core group, the following aspects should be considered. And this is not an all-inclusive list of considerations, but maybe have a look at experience as a flight instructor, experience as a FSTD instructor, possibly all-attitude flying experience, previous multi-crew experience, and then for me, very importantly, the motivation to deliver UPRT. Because it's going to take a lot of time, effort, and motivation to be put into this program in order for the instructor to successfully deliver it. The Train the Trainer course for the instructors is aimed to qualify instructors to deliver effective and correct simulator UPRT, and then to enable them to train the remaining regular instructors of the operator. So as an example, the initial Train the Trainer course for the core group of FSTD instructors may include pre-studies and academic instructor training, on aeroplane UPRT, and FSTD training. Typically, the Train the Trainer course takes 4 to 5 days at the ATO and a further week back at home base in the company of the instructor from the ATO to supervise the program. The course contains detailed academics on aeroplane and FSTD training. The academic training elements for instructors include knowledge and the use of the FSTDs, in other words, understanding that there is no G-awareness in the aeroplane, understanding the validated training envelope to ensure that what we experience in the simulator is as realistic and reliable as what we will experience from the real aircraft. Important that he understands the UPRT related functions of the iOS for providing accurate feedback on the flight crew's performance. It's important that he understands the motion capabilities of the instructor, and then he's able to carry out instructor-led exercises. The FSTD instructor training for the core group should include a part where the instructor flies the recovery maneuvers as a trainee, and a second part where he practices teaching under supervision. This instructor training does not necessarily need to be type specific, as in some cases the core group will be made up of instructors from several fleets within the or from the initial UPRT trainer course. Chapter 5 of document 111 and AC 120-111 describe the training elements and subject areas of the instructor training to ensure that accurate UPRT and how to minimize the risk of negative training. They state that on-aeroplane training for the core group of instructors is not a requirement. It is, however, recommended to allow the core group to acquire first-hand experience of the critical human factors that are present during recoveries from upsets. So why is on-aircraft instructor training for FSTD instructors important? Well, firstly, let's discuss the immersive experience. I really like this term. What we mean by this is that the core group need first-hand experience in upset, startle, and recovery to teach it properly. Now, I want you to imagine how different it would be to teach someone how to drive on a busy freeway when you yourself have only driven around the block, or to perhaps teach someone to land on an aircraft carrier when you yourself have only read about it or perhaps watched the movie Top Gun. So that is what I mean by the immersive experience. And then there's the human factors side and startle. One needs to understand fully that a pilot's brain functions differently under stress and startle, compared to obviously when there's no stress or little stress. So flying a real aircraft and experiencing UPRT is certainly the best way to understand the coping mechanisms around which the training program is designed. The core group will later on train the other regular instructors who normally do not possess this experience, and they'll have to rely on the expertise of the core group to compensate for this gap. And then there's, of course, counterintuitive behavior. Many of the recoveries that students will learn will be counterintuitive. Several vitally important flight control inputs required by pilots during upset recovery maneuvers are considered to be counterintuitive. This during a time when your heart rate has gone up, and of course, at the same time, your IQ goes down. So training is needed to enable the crews to perform counterintuitive actions reliably. Some of the conditions that require counterintuitive reactions may be, for instance, unloading or pushing during a stall, recovery in a nose-down situation. Now, AC 120.111 divides instructor standardization into initial standardization, validation, and continuing standardization. But in general, standardization topics should include correct demonstration of the operator or OEM's recommended upset recovery techniques and SOPs, the ability to distinguish between SOPs and recommended techniques, the understanding of the importance of adhering to the scenarios that have been validated by the training program developer, and of course, correct facilitation of the scenarios to the trainees, capabilities and limitations of the FSTD to avoid negative training, and understanding the missing critical human factor aspects because of the limitations of the FSTD's motion systems, and then being able to convey this to the trainees to support their resilience in an upset. As far as academic training is concerned, a prerequisite really for successful UPRT is a thorough understanding of the environmental factors, the aerodynamics, the flight dynamics, aircraft performance, aircraft design principles, and human factors. So a good pre-simulator academic training program is therefore a vital component for the success of any UPRT program. Now, there are several ways to go about achieving this. Before developing the academic plan, operators should first really identify the possible gaps that exist in the theoretical knowledge of their pilots, and then use the variety of existing publications or apps that are available in the market to develop the academic part of the UPRT program. Theoretical training should include self-study as well as classroom instruction in the form of maybe a pre-sim briefing, which from my experience should be about a maximum of 2 hours just before the simulator session. The time frame between the academic self-study and the practical training in the simulator should always be kept as short as possible to promote the integration of the theory into practice. Another important consideration is that most airline pilots will never have flown the real aeroplane at high altitude, and many have never flown the simulated high altitude either. So it's important to include a suitable model for energy management into the academic program, as well as in the simulator session itself. Most of the OEMs and ICAO have created recommended training sequences from the Training Aid Revision 3, and these sequences are grouped by aircraft handling characteristics, upset recognition and recovery, the stall, environmental factors, the effect of wake turbulence, mechanical system-induced factors, and of course, pilot-induced factors. Let's discuss some of the conceptual aspects to a good airline UPRT program. Now, upset prevention recovery is not an isolated art. It should form part of your airline's current safety concept of threat and error management. And the Upset Recovery Training Aid Revision 3 defines an airplane upset as an undesirable or undesired airplane state. Threats and errors may ultimately cause undesired aircraft states. As far as pilot monitoring and situational awareness is concerned, the focus on these techniques is important. Effective flight path monitoring results in increased situational awareness and avoidance of threats and errors that are related to undesired aircraft states. It plays a key role in the prevention of UPRT. As a basic rule, maneuver-based training should take place before the scenario-based training. The maneuver-based training is generally done as instructor-led exercises, as I said earlier on, with the instructor in one of the crew seats, which then leads to the scenarios in which the students can apply what they've been taught in the scenario-based training. It's called, of course, repetition to proficiency. The UPRT simulator sessions should be long enough to allow for enough time for the crew to repeat the upset recovery strategy until they are proficient and, most importantly, confident. Giving a pilot confidence is very important in helping him to cope with fear and startle in a real-life situation. The SMS, FOCA, and LOC-I data should then be used subsequent to the training to monitor trends within the airline with regards to undesired aircraft states. It's also important that the ATO responsible for the UPRT training carry out regular quality assurance checks, which will help to monitor and correct any instructor drift. So in summary, I love this quote by Lieutenant Grossman: "Frightened human beings will only do what they're trained to do. You don't rise to the occasion, you sink to the level of your training." That concludes my presentation. Thank you for joining me, and over to you, BJ.
Great presentation, Brad. I know you just got in from a simulator session and sat down and joined us, so really appreciate your time coming all the way from South Africa today. Anything you want to add to your presentation at all before we get started on questions? And by the way, I encourage everybody, if you have questions for Brad, go ahead and put them into the comment stream. Brad?
Well, thanks, BJ. Yeah, it's been a long day. It's pretty late here in the evening, but it's been good to be back into training. You know, we've had a long layoff from flying due to the situation around the world that I'm sure many pilots found themselves in. So it really is good to be back in the cockpit and applying what we learn in UPRT to our daily operation. You know, when I initially gave this presentation, I think it took me 28 minutes to get through it. And I had to cut out a little bit or modify here and there, summarize a bit more efficiently on what I wanted to say. So, you know, 15 minutes is a pretty short amount of time to put together everything that is required for an effective airline UPRT program. But I think, you know, I covered the highlights there. One thing that I thought about afterwards, and it was a slide that I took out, was with regards to the OEM's recommendations and how important it is to make sure that you always follow OEM recommendations when you design your UPRT program. You know, I work specifically with Airbus, and I have done a bit of work with the Boeing program as well. And, you know, we developed our program in consultation with Airbus, who at the time, UPRT was a pretty new concept to their training plans, so to speak, because of the fact that the aircraft are fly-by-wire, et cetera, and had been successfully flown around the world and saved on many occasions by the fantastic design principles of the Airbus. But the OEMs were quite involved with the writing of the Aeroplane Upset Recovery Aid Training 3, and of course the earlier revision as well. But that's all I just want to say is any program that is built or designed should really be done in consultation with the OEM to make sure that all their principles, operating procedures, etc., and of course the technical design of the airplane is taken into account.
Awesome. Great, Brad. I was curious now, you know, with your experience on the Boeing airplane, you know, there's a perception out there that it's quite complicated to implement UPRT on the Airbus. And that's kind of the way I feel. What are your thoughts on that? Is the Airbus a difficult platform to implement UPRT, or how do you approach it?
Well, absolutely. You know, the Airbus is quite a complex aeroplane in terms of the design principles around the flight control laws and protections. And actually, most pilots who have completed the course have only really just touched the surface of how the intricacies of those protections work. You know, it's put into one or two of the sim sessions initially and a little bit later on in the conversion. But in an upset situation, one really has to have a fundamental understanding of exactly what's going on in the background with regards to how the computers are manipulating the flight controls. It's not a system that's completely fail-proof, and I think Airbus have made their customers aware of that. It still requires pilot intervention. You know, we still need thinking pilots in the cockpit, and I think pilots in general have approached the Airbus in a way, hoping that one day, you know, pilots will not have to make any decisions. The airplane will make all the decisions for them. But you know, it doesn't work that way. When we started our UPRT program, we used the Airbus A330 simulator because we owned the simulator at the time. The other simulators were hired. So it was a bit cheaper for us to put our pilots through that, through the course on the 600 simulator. But you know, the Airbus A330 is quite a long, large, heavy aeroplane with a lot of inertia. And it was quite a challenge to get the UPRT done within the validated training envelope and to make sure that there was no negative training that was taking place. It's quite easy for an instructor to put the aeroplane into a situation where it's almost impossible for the student to recover simply by the way that he has put the aeroplane into the upset, which probably would not normally happen in real life. But those were some of the challenges that we faced. We had to make sure that the instructors were trained 100% and were standardized in terms of putting the aeroplane into the upset, flying it into the upset, firstly, so that you're not doing it in an unnatural or in a way that contradicts anything that is or outside of the validated training envelope, and then allowing the student to recover such a large aircraft such as the A330 successfully, especially in a situation like a nose-low overbanked situation where the roll rate is incredibly slow, to have the students recover successfully and then attain the confidence that you need to then go further in your career and apply the strategy that you've learned from an upset. So that was quite a challenge, and really we spent a tremendous amount of time with our instructors making sure that they flew the airplanes into the upset exactly the same way all the time to avoid that kind of situation.
Excellent. Brad, we have a question from Roberto that I put into the channel there, and I think it's great, and I know you have experience with this. He says, what are your thoughts on UPRT instructors having aerobatics background? Any cons?
Cons, I can't really think of many cons to having aerobatic experience, because that foundation for the all-attitude environment, flying in aerobatic competitions or air show type flying, can only be of benefit. The instructor is going to be faced with situations where the student puts the aeroplane into or recovers using certain techniques. The scope and the dynamics of an upset are huge, and for a pilot to have substantial aerobatic experience, that he can understand exactly what's going on all the time from a aerodynamic point of view, as well as possibly from a human factors point of view, is quite important. When we selected instructors to go on the training course, we ended up with 12 instructors that were specifically trained as dedicated UPRT instructors, who only gave UPRT training for about the first year, just to get all our pilots, our 750 pilots, through the program. And these instructors that we chose, we didn't have enough instructors in the airline who had all attitude experience, and who also had the passion and the motivation to deliver UPRT. So we decided to take, as a sort of an experiment, to take 6 pilots who had substantial aerobatic experience, guys who were aerobatic champions, a guy that had won the world aerobatic champion. I'd flown a lot of low-level airshow flying displays, about 500 of them over the past 18 years before I started doing this. And I was chosen to lead it just simply because I had that background. And half our instructors had this substantial on-aircraft aerobatic experience, and our other half had very little all-attitude experience. But we had to give them a chance as well. They found the on-aircraft training that they did through the ATO absolutely vital. They learned a lot. In fact, even our guys who had flown, who had a substantial aerobatic background, learned a tremendous amount. Guys who I thought you couldn't teach anything, learned a tremendous amount by going on an on-aircraft UPRT training course, simply from the fact of how to deliver this UPRT and make students understand how startle affects the way that they react and behave as pilots. But I must say, we're happy to see that our group of pilots that were not that didn't have a tremendous amount of aerobatic experience or no experience at all in aerobatics did equally well as the other pilots. They took a little bit longer, and they had to. They used me as a source of information for times when they weren't sure if they were giving the correct answer, because they just didn't have that deep foundation from an all-attitude point of view. But really, the quality of UPRT that they delivered was just as good as the guys that had a lot of all-attitude experience.
And I think that one of your criteria, Brad, that you mentioned, which I think is instrumental in that, was having a passion to teach UPRT, which would imply that they're trainable. You know, as we know, you can take an extra 300 and pull out a lot of transferable techniques and methods that can transfer across all fixed wing airplanes, but you can also use that airplane to teach very type specific, unique techniques that only work in that airplane that are completely dangerous to try to transfer to any other type of an aircraft. So I think that's fully mitigated by having the right instructors on your team. So I think that was a great answer. All right. Anything else to add on that, Brad?
No, thanks, BJ.
All right. Let's bring this open up by Skip. Great presentation, and it was great, Brad. He has his answer to another question, but this, have you seen a degradation of UPRT skills due to the lack of proficiency flying from crews due to the pandemic? And how are you incorporating CRM, TAM, threat and error management, in the sim to get them back up to speed? How's that being approached, Brad?
So what we're doing now is all pilots that have had a long break from flying are being put through we call it a resumption of training course. The first thing is to just get their sign-on procedures and their flows back, the general stuff that they're going to, the SOPs within the aircraft. But the second session, in fact, it's one of the sessions I just did today, is a full handling session where the pilots are, there's no autopilot available. Very seldom is there a flight director available. Sometimes the bird on the or the flight path vector on the Airbus is not available, but it's all about learning attitudes again, and maneuvering margins at low altitude, at high altitude, stalling the aeroplane again at low altitude, getting a feel for what it feels like to stall the aeroplane at high altitude as well. You know, the amount of altitude that one requires to recover at high altitude is different. So we're just basically getting them back to aviation thinking. Then they go through a proficiency check, which is 2 simulator sessions, and straight after that they do a full 4-hour UPRT simulator session again. By the time that they get to that UPRT simulator session, they're already that'll be their 5th sim session. So their manual handling is already almost back up to speed. It's not quite what it was, obviously, before the pandemic, but because we've taught them a lot of the pilots from the airline that we worked with, because they understand the concept of the strategy that we've taught them, the technique for recovering that should recover an aeroplane from, we would call it an all-attitude upset recovery strategy. Because this has been part of their fabric of their flying for the past, since 2013, so that would be 7 years, it's almost the same as saying the words fly, navigate, communicate. You know, for them, the strategy comes pretty natural, and it doesn't take long to get back into applying that strategy. Yes, there are things that they're going to have forgotten, so it's important that we recap on some of the principles, the aerodynamic principles, and they would obviously have to redo their whole academic program again, as well as writing exams. As far as CRM and TEM, you know, that forms part of every simulator session that we do, be it UPRT or a PPC. But we have brought this into the briefing again to get the pilots to understand how CRM fits into the recovery strategy, how the pilots are going to behave under startle and stress, the importance of effective communication and how we're going to communicate, the use of the automation. You know, that all comes back into their core competencies that fit into the CRM or the CREM-TEM model. So we spend quite a bit of time rebriefing that part of the flying with them, of revising the strategy for recovering from all these upsets. And you know, that strategy that we apply is actually designed really to incorporate CRM and the core competencies that you need to recover from an upset.
Great. Thank you, Brad. And I see we're running out of time, but that was an excellent answer. Just remind people to look for in the comment thread the link to submit your questions, or we didn't get to them today, or some occur to you. And session 9 is next. And if Brad has time, he's going to jump over there. I totally understand if you need to go to bed, though, Brad. So don't feel you need to be there. We hope to see everybody there. We hope everybody enjoyed the presentation. And thank you, Brad, for taking time out of your schedule to come here today.
Thanks, BJ. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for coming here. We will see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.